Hello there, and welcome to this thoroughly splendid new podcast from Buro Happold called, quite simply, Sandbox. I'm Andy Duncan, and I'll be your regular host as we take a journey into those big questions that touch all our lives. Each episode, we will be bringing together Buro Happold's finest array of experts who will bring their curiosity and expertise to the table. And we'll also be inviting a special guest who will each have their own take and authoritative heft on the subject we're discussing. And what, I hear you cry, are my credentials for hosting this? Quite simply, I have none. Apart from a thoroughly beguiling smile and chocolatey speaking tones, I am very much in touch with my humility, but I like to think that I was chosen to host this show because I am the very embodiment of ignorance. I am an exemplar of the form. What it really comes down to is that I am the man who is not afraid to ask the questions that everyone else is frankly too embarrassed to ask. Why? Quite simply because I don't even know that it is embarrassing that I don't already know the answer. And so we come to our first episode, which I personally believe should have been entitled Water Palaver or H2O Dear. But my suggestions were banned as swiftly as a British hosepipe on the first day of summer. Having said that, the actual title is Troubled Waters. I feel a song coming on. Only I don't, because the PRS will hit us hard for royalties on Simon and Garfunkel's behalf. Today, we are talking about water. As Tom Lehrer once wisely said, life is like a sewer. What you get out of it depends on what you put in. But arguably, now, more than ever, the relationship between our lives and our water networks are more crucial than ever. Joining me on this, and here comes a pun, deep dive into water usage are our special guests today. First of all, Louise Clarke.
Thanks for having me today. I'm Louise Clarke. My background's as a civil engineer. I actually come from a whole family of civil engineers, which makes for really interesting conversation at the dinner table, particularly if you're not an engineer. And my background is in integrated water management, strategic planning of water and wastewater infrastructure. And I'm quite interested in moving to much more sustainable ways of using our water. I'm from Australia, which you may have picked up from my Australian twang. And we have huge water problems in Australia where, we're either in drought and not getting enough water anywhere. And then the next day it's pouring down and you're in flood. So it was really quite formative in my career. And thanks for having me today.
Thank you very much for joining us, Louise. And we also have Duncan Ker-Reid. Good morning, Duncan.
Hi, Andy. Duncan Ker-Reid. I'm a technical director in the water group here at Buro Happold. My main areas of interest is the natural environment, especially the sort of hydrology side of the water cycle, what goes outside of our cities in the natural environment. I found incredibly interesting. It's that amazing thing about water. We see it serene, peaceful, and yet at the same time, at the other end of the spectrum, it can be so incredibly destructive. There's something enigmatic about water. Just makes me really excited to be involved with that on a daily basis. And Louise and I work together very nicely with a focus more on the urban water distribution and management side, and me looking at the sort of natural environment. We tend to form a nice duo there.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And finally, but by no means leastly, if that is indeed a word, to our special guest today, Tom McNamara.
Hello, my name's Tom. I'm the founder and director of FreeUp, and we're a clean tech startup that basically is making water quality sensing far more affordable and cheap. And also, by that effort, democratizing the ability to look at these things on large scales. My background is from research, and I also have a passion for the outdoors. So I've been told that I have that kind of unusual overlap of being able to talk to people who aren't in a lab and also build things that come from a lab. Although by the looks on people's faces, sometimes I definitely lean too much into the detail and the science.
Thank you very much, Tom. Lovely to have you on the show. And like I say, I'm here to make sure that things don't get too dry, though as we're talking about water, that shouldn't be too difficult. Water. Why do we have either too much or too little in the UK? It's estimated that the UK as a whole gets through around 14 billion litres of water a day, and we lose 3.17 billion litres of this through leaks. That's 1,268 Olympic swimming pools, or 3 of a typical teenager's showers. I'm joking, of course, but the average single-person household gets through around 149 litres of water a day. I use most of my 149 litres through the medium of tea. But it shouldn't be my problem, surely. Too much water? Too little water? Water usage is easy. We have loads of rain each year. Last year, we had 1,290 millimetres of rainfall. That might not be enough to prompt Noah to build an ark, but it is definitely enough for him to invest in a new pair of galoshes and start matchmaking some animals. We can easily fill reservoirs. What I'm saying, panel, is, given all the flooding we have, surely water shortage is a simple fix, isn't it? What do you think, Tom?
It's a question of the quality as well. So it may be that teenagers are happy to shower in questionable water quality, but I'm sure that as a connoisseur of tea, you want it to be the kind of best water possible to bring out those leaves. Also, it's not just holding the water back for later use, whatever that may be. It's also basically refining it to make it go from river water to tea quality water. And obviously that has energy input, it has other kind of chemical inputs. And also then once you've used that water, it has to go somewhere again. So if we're looking at a very human-centric perspective and we don't care about building lots of reservoirs and other kind of big infrastructure, the problem isn't too difficult, but people do like the outdoors, they do like the environment, and we need it. So it's also quite a complex interbalance between the quality, the impacts, and also making sure that everyone has a kind of fair usage of these things and impact on them.
Thank you, Tom. And Louise, what are your thoughts?
As well as the quality, water really needs to fall into the right place as well, where it's being collected and where you can actually keep it and use it for our cities and for the environment as well.
Thank you, Louise. Just on that subject, and I'm talking here, like I said at the start, I am the anti-font of all knowledge, to use a suitably watery pun. When you say water falling into the right place, how do we get water to fall into the right place?
It's having reservoirs in the right location, if we're looking at water reservoirs. But it's also having our sustainable urban drainage systems so that we're infiltrating water back into our groundwater systems. The amount of urbanisation we have really restricts water from infiltrating into the ground, which is the way water would have flowed in the future. We do get a lot of our water from groundwater. Historically, it's looking at where the reservoirs are placed. On the topic of reservoirs, which Tom alluded to before, they're really great in that they capture water for us, but there's sort of other effects of reservoirs that we sort of need to consider as well. And maybe building lots and lots of reservoirs, probably need to consider some of the other parts of that as well. They release a lot of methane when they're built because all the plants and the animals decompose when it gets flooded. That methane release over time is actually really quite potent, and more potent in terms of its heating potential than carbon dioxide. Yeah, that's probably another thing to consider when we're trying to put at infrastructure, locations, and how we're going to collect our water for the future.
I think it also comes down to the morphology of these systems. So again, it's a seemingly technical word, but all it means is imagine putting concrete everywhere. The moment the rain falls within reason, it's going to run off the land and go into the sea. So now all of your tea water and other water is now in the ocean where you can't use it. Whereas if it falls onto kind of bogs and forests and those types of things, it's a bit like a sponge. It'll get wet, it'll retain that moisture, and then you can pull that water out at a later date. So humans have done a really good job of making all our cities drain really quickly, all these kind of areas that we use drain really quickly. But it means that any water that falls on those areas, the water can't really be used by us. And ironically, it then makes the flooding event more likely because the water rushes off and ends up in one location, i.e. the river, very quickly. So actually, it's not just a question of quality and quantity, it's also the morphology. So the way in which we have built our civilization really focuses that rain to get rid of it as quickly as possible. And I think there's a really interesting kind of aspect to human psychology here, where the moment you turn on your tap, you expect to have fresh water coming out of it because you paid for it. And the moment kind of rain hits your roof, you want it gone because you don't want water on your property.
Now, Duncan, on that subject, I was looking at a Buro Happold project called Mayfield Park, and there it seems like the people who created that are directly addressing issues of water infiltration, sustainable water attenuation and drainage. Could you talk a little bit about that sort of project, and could that be more of a futuristic thing for projects in general?
Well, Mayfield as a project based in the centre of Manchester, rather than leaving the centre to urbanise even more, it's opening that space up, providing a parkland, a place for people to enjoy, but also an area where when we do get significant rainfall over Manchester, there's a space there for that water to spread out to flood the landscape. That helps to limit the impact on the downstream people. So it itself, as a park, it provides that wonderful societal role in dry weather conditions, but it also provides a benefit during those flood conditions. And that is one of my key interests, is trying to deliver those sort of dual use spaces that provide real value to communities, both in the dry condition, but also in the wet condition as well. And because you're attracting people, you want that space to be as inviting as possible. Open up green spaces, grass, lawns, places for people to sit, picnic, etc. It needs to be a nice environment, and people don't want to be sat next to the water if that water quality is poor. So it's about making sure that you're putting in the right measures to make sure that that water environment is as nice and enjoyable and as available to people to use as possible.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I'm now going to move on to why are we in this pickle? Why are our water systems failing us so badly? Or are they failing us? Or are we failing them? I was reading about the Great Stink, which sounds like it wasn't the most fun time to be around. And I was reading about there's this new mega sewer that's opening in London in 2025. So let's have a little bit of a chat about what's going on with our water systems now and what's actually happening right now. What projects are in place right now that could possibly help us? Let's go to Duncan first this time.
We shouldn't shy away from the fact that because water is so necessary for maintaining life, there is a tremendous amount of conflict when it comes to access to the clean water, but also taking away the dirty water and making sure we're safe from natural disasters. So we need to have systems in place to make sure we deal with each of those components. Going back to the Great Stink, that was mainly related to sanitation. Okay, the dirty water dumped into the Thames made sure that it was such a putrid environment that finally the lawmakers at the time engaged with the problem. Maybe parallels there with the current discharges into the river systems. But from that, there was a drive to make sure that we had systems in place to deal with the sanitation. And we, as engineers in our role, we have to make sure we're putting in the right systems to address both those clean water, the sanitation, and also the flood protection and the emergency management. We talked a little bit about the supply of water. From taking away the wastewater, most of our homes are in a position where we have connections to wastewater systems. We have our waste taken away. So we're very fortunate that we don't have to deal so much with the complex issues regarding our wastewater.
Just think about a two-tier system. You talk about the water coming in to our homes and the water that's then going out. What is the feasibility of, we get this lovely clean drinking water coming into our homes, which we make our lovely tea with our tea quality water, and our teenagers can have their myriad showers. But then this grey water that then just gets flushed away, that could be used in gardens. I think, am I right in thinking that drinking quality water is used in car washes? What are the pros and cons of something like a two-tier system? Let's go to Tom for the pros and cons of a two-tier system along those lines.
I think a two-tier system makes quite a lot of sense because I often think it's a little bit mad that we wash our cars and flush our loos with drinking water. That seems slightly indulgent, I think, in any society, no matter your resources. And again, I think this kind of whole problem has really arisen because we have cities. A lot of people live in those cities, so you've got a lot of kind of concentration of resources and the use of those resources. That's why we then have to pipe in water from very far away, pipe sewage back out, treat it, and put it back in the river. But really, you could, for example, use rainwater to flush loos. If the building's large enough, you can irrigate with various qualities of water. And there isn't the necessity to have all water be the grade of drinking water. But obviously, there's then economies of scale, which I'm sure Duncan and Louise will touch upon. No one solution can fix all the problems. And I think this is why it's quite a difficult subject. And again, a terrible analogy that I've seen to now use for years because I haven't ever replaced it is that water quality seems to be a little bit like happiness. Kind of everyone knows what it means to them, but the definition on what those variables are is really different depending on use case. Now, if you're irrigating crops, that's very different from brushing your teeth or making tea, but it really should be that we're using water at the point we're using it rather than by default just shipping it around the country. Because again, with climate change, we're going to see 30% wetter winters, 60% drier summers. And what that will do is when rain falls, not all of the rain runs into rivers. Some of it evaporates, some of it's used for kind of biological activity. So actually, when you increase the kind of wetness or you have flooding, it's going to cause a disproportionate effect. The southeast of England may be 60% drier. Now, quite a lot of that rain's already just evaporating into the air. So they're going to have to pipe water from Wales probably across down to the southeast. And if people could only use water where it was and have a bit of retention, they'll never fix the problem entirely, but it would definitely help not ship water hundreds of miles across the country, which just seems a little bit crazy to me as the kind of default action.
I think you raised a really good point there, Tom. You really hit the nail on the head. One solution isn't a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. It doesn't apply everywhere. Grey water in particular is something that we absolutely should be pushing for, and recycled water as well, and using water where it's generated. And the potential to use grey water, which is capture water from non-polluted sources like a shower or a tap, and you reuse it for things that you don't need to drink it with, essentially. And there's so much opportunity for that, but it's really only able to be adopted in more new build situations where you can build it into the design. Whereas when we're looking at older buildings and trying to retrofit those sorts of things, and you have to have two pipe systems within the actual plumbing of the building, it becomes a lot more difficult. And then I think in those situations, it's looking at it more sort of a catchment scale, and what can we do in a wider catchment to make the best use of our recycled water and use it to supplement our current water supplies and reduce our overall demand is really something that is going to be more of a focus in the future.
Thank you. And I guess that there is an issue with public perception of the use of grey water. I was reading about the International Space Station where 80% of water is recycled. Am I right in thinking even the condensation is put back into the system? It's recycling urine and sweat through a chain of filters and bacteria and chemical reactions. Now, you tell a teenager to go out and spray the garden with that. That's going to be an issue. I'm just wondering, how do we address and how do we change people's perception of the use of grey water?
There's two components to it. There is that degree of education that needs to come, that the water is appropriate for its use. We shouldn't be distributing water that is unsafe for human contact, especially if we're asking people, as you say, spray that on their garden. We don't want people getting ill. So there needs to be the appropriate technologies in place to make sure that those are safe. But it's about explaining to people that you don't need to use potable water to water your garden. Most of us have no problem with using water from our water butts. Whereas if you looked at the bottom of a water butt at the end of the summer as it comes out to dry, I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue that was clean. We already acknowledge that it's okay to use less than potable water quality for our gardens. But I think it's about getting people into the mentality that comes from their own recycled water. I think that will take some time. There's a secondary idea to it, which is about price pressure as well, is that it takes a lot of energy, a lot of infrastructure to produce clean water. And if we're using potable water for irrigating our gardens, it's likely to cost us, the individual or wider society, much more to be spreading that water across our gardens than it is to recycle water. Effectively, we've already paid the most of the cost for and reuse. And with the expected increase in the price of water over time as water becomes more scarce and our water bills go up, I think that economic pressure will also help people to come around to the idea of reusing water.
It's definitely all about education. Recycled water goes into our rivers all the time anyway, and it's normally treated to the right standard. When you use recycled water for a non-potable source, actually the amount of treatment it goes through is exceptionally clean. And it's all about just an understanding of what kind of standards it's being treated to. There's a lot of news about untreated discharges going into our seas and our rivers. That's water that hasn't gone through the treatment process. But what we're talking about here is water that is treated and is actually extremely clean and sterile and able to be used. I think it's a lot more about just an understanding and bringing people through that learning process. We work with water every day. So we have gone through this learning journey in our whole careers, whereas people who don't work in water haven't had that opportunity. So it's all about giving them that same opportunity as well.
Just to jump in as well, I think, again, like you cited the space station because obviously it's like a little tin can orbiting the Earth all the time. But what people listening to the podcast might not know, and it might unsettle them, which is always useful to change opinions, is that obviously a river goes a very long distance. So actually there are examples in the UK where a perfectly good water that's treated from a sewage plant enters the river and then it's extracted further downstream for drinking water somewhere else. So actually you basically are already reusing some of the water in the UK. It's just because it goes into the river, you think it's outdoors now, but it's just like an outdoor pipe really. And I think when you look at kind of human psychology and economic effects, you've got things such as neighborhood effects. And that's just an economic term for if you build something and it causes a problem somewhere else, but you didn't pay those people for the inconvenience that it caused them, you're not really passing on the true cost of that product. So again, people listening to the podcast might just think, I just want like fresh water all the time for everything. That's not really an option because it will eventually just not work. But because people, as Lucy said, don't always work in water, they don't realize that actually at some point this will not work anymore. And also with human psychology and changing behaviors, there's kind of a really famous 3-point system. One is the trigger, second is the behavior, and then third is a reward. So the trigger of I don't want to use anything but drinking water is because they don't realize there's a different option. And then the response is I just want drinking water. And then the reward is I know it's safe. But going back to Duncan's point, if you had a water garden in your garden, so you're redirecting some of the rainwater from your kind of roof into a garden, your trigger then is, oh, it's raining. The kind of garden's filling it with water. The response and enjoyment of that is then seeing these kind of beautiful flowers, all this life that you've made happen. You've reduced the burden on the sewage facilities. You've reduced the burden from abstraction, and you've actually done a really good thing. And you can change that kind of human behavior from a very academic podcast to something where actually you look out of your kind of window and you're quite happy it's raining and you're doing a good thing, but it requires no spend, no effort, no action. And it's because you understand that you're actually really helping everyone else out and you get something beautiful at the end of it.
That's a really interesting idea and something I've been thinking about a lot, because as I'm looking outside the window now, I can see the rain bouncing off my neighbours' roofs. And we see all the time now, photovoltaic panels are everywhere. But what's the feasibility? And is there technology that's being developed to make it more widely available? Could I harvest more efficiently now the rain that's falling onto my roof, almost like rainfall flannels rather than solar panels?
We all understand the idea of a water butt, and a water butt is effectively rainwater harvesting, and we do it on a small scale in our gardens. But you can scale that principle up for very large buildings. We're talking things like warehouses or even stadia, which have huge roofs, where you get an opportunity to capture the water that falls on those, collect that water and store it. And unlike the water butt I said earlier, we do need to treat it to stop some of that sludge that comes in to our water butts. We don't want that in our buildings. But we can then use that water for the non-potable uses that we've been talking about, normally flushing toilets or other non-potable uses like washing external areas or landscaping, etc. So it's all about trying to maximize the amount of water you can capture. If you've got a very big roof, then yes, I definitely recommend it.
Fantastic.
Perfection is the enemy of doing, and even just having a water butt, it's kind of low tech, it's old tech, but it does actually just retain water. It's not thrilling and exciting, and it hasn't got a screen showing you how much money you've saved, but it does actually make a material impact. And just scaling whatever solution you have for water retention, whether it be a really big water garden, a small water butt, it all actually makes a difference. And some utilities are actually paying for homeowners to install water butts because it helps them and it helps the burden on everyone else. So I would say doing anything is a positive, and please don't be deadlocked into doing nothing because it isn't new, it isn't exciting. Because again, as you said, Andy, part of the sewer network in the Thames was built kind of hundreds of years ago, and that still works really nicely. So it doesn't need to be new to be exciting, positive.
Thank you very much. And talk about new and exciting, although my brother's a Tottenham Hotspur fan, so he'll be appalled that I'm bringing this up willingly. But Arsenal's stadium, I believe, Duncan, you know quite a bit about this.
The benefit of a stadium is you have this very large roof. So with our reasonably regular rainfall here in the UK, there's an opportunity there to capture water. Even very small amounts of rainfall, when magnified over such a large roof area, can produce a significant volume. That water can be collected, stored down within a stadium. There is lots of space underneath the stands. You can put in place the storage required to capture this water, and then that water can be filtered, treated, so it's available for reuse. And one of the big water demands in a stadium, although it's quite intermittent, of course, is the flushing of toilets, usually pre-game, half-time, and at the end, a big rush to the gents or the ladies.
Or the nervous wait before a penalty shootout.
Yes, indeed. There's an opportunity there to reduce the demand you have on the water network in those pulses by providing some of that water from the rainwater that you've collected. That's a really good example of saying, here we have a demand where we can use recycled water. Here we have an opportunity to collect that water. It's simply the water butt system, but scaled up and implemented for a modern day challenge.
Brilliant. Thank you, Duncan. That sounds very exciting. Like we've been saying, some of the old tech works a treat. There's new exciting tech that's coming along, new exciting infrastructure that's coming along. So what we should do now is have our sliding doors moment. So let's cast our minds 50 years, say, into the future and discuss what each of you, I'm going to go to each of you and ask what your dream water infrastructure will look like. So like I say, maybe just as many houses now harness the sun with solar panels. Maybe we can in the future tap into rainfall with roof-mounted rainfall flannels. What is your ideal scenario? And also, what if we do nothing? What if we change nothing? How bad can it be? What is our worst case scenario? So we're going to take a diverging two histories now with each of you. And I think let's go to Louise first.
If we don't do anything, firstly, I don't really think that's an option, to be honest. I think to be able to go into the future, we do need to change the way we deal with water, and we obviously need to adapt and create more water somehow in the future. And what I would really like to see in the future, and it's something that I spoke about recently at a conference in Istanbul, is trying to manage our water better at a catchment level. And it's something that the authorities in England are starting to move towards at the moment. But I'd really like to see it not just from a water authority perspective, but actual developments as well. We often see water as like an add-on or something that we need to address as part of our development proposals. But if we were to think about it as something that was really complementary and front and center of our development, we could see so many great changes in the urban environment, and we'd have a lot more water availability. We'd be recharging our groundwater wherever we could. And really, I'd like to see a lot of legislation changes and regulations that force the hand of new development to use recycled water, use grey water, limit water use, not having these unnecessary water features, and talking to people around us. Who else is in our catchment? What are their issues? What are the issues coming up in the future? And that sort of collaborative planning, I think, would be a wonderful place to be in the next 50 years.
Thank you very much, Louise. That sounds like a very lovely place to be. What happens if we do nothing, Louise? What then?
If we do nothing, the area that would be at great risk is, of course, our environment. We see our ecosystems who depend on water would be at risk. We would see a lot of impacts there. We'd probably have to build a lot of major infrastructure. So desalination plants, for example, would be one solution to that problem. While they are a great option, there's lots of other impacts that they have as well. For every litre of water you produce, another litre of super salty brine water, which you need to manage, which either goes back into the water, into the sea, or you need to somehow evaporate it or do something else with the salt. Actually, quite interesting on desalination. Locating those desalination plants is also another really interesting and difficult topic, actually, because it can't be located too close to other communities. You need to have the infall, outfall pipes be located at the right place. That's another reason why I think we need to look at this more holistically, so that we don't have to rely on something that might be quite difficult to implement, actually.
Thank you, Louise. And I'll go to Tom next.
I think, unfortunately, the kind of do nothing option is one that people often take. And I'm sure we've all been there when you've had to have an awkward conversation, make a presentation for work or something. And often just the beginning is the hard bit. And because you know it won't be a perfect start, you almost do nothing because you want to have a really good beginning. And I think the problem with all of this is that it's a very complex subject. And there's so many variables, because if you live in Scotland, it's very different from living in the south. Wales is very different from the kind of east of England. And that's before you even start to overlay politics or kind of other infrastructure. Obviously, at FreeUp, what we're looking to do is to enable people to have a really good overview, actually understand things so people can begin. Farmers can put land aside for better water retention. Councils can enable housing where actually it won't flood and it won't cause too much of a burden, and then kind of other kind of actions. So I think we really need to all be on the same page that there is a problem that will happen in the future, but we can begin dealing with it now. And there's other things that have already happened. Going back to your kind of question about what's the kind of the poor outcome, Andy, is that we've already lost quite a few fish species from the south of Wales because it's now just too warm. Climate change and indirect action of humanity. No one's kind of put bad things in the river. The river's too warm now for the fish to basically breed. So that's already an issue. Water scarcity causes other issues. So even when you look beyond humanity, there's still things going wrong. And if we do nothing, simply a lot of things will fall apart pretty quickly, because 90% of the economy, if you're fiscally minded, uses water at some point. So 9/10 of all of humanity's output will basically stop. So I think what we need to do is we need to all have a shared understanding that there is a problem, a shared understanding that we all have to kind of chip in to fix this. And from that, we need to have a clear understanding of kind of what interventions matter where, because it won't be a one size fits all. And I think if we do absolutely nothing will change tomorrow, the week after, maybe even next year. But just the reports of things going wrong, we will just slowly get used to until major infrastructure just doesn't work anymore. And it really adversely affects some people, but maybe not all. So I think we really do need to start making changes now. It's a positive thing that we have the chance to do it. And we all need to just work together with really good information to just get things done and not to blame everyone else. Because ultimately, when rain falls on a hill and flows downstream. It'll pass through kind of landowners, it'll pass industry, it'll pass cities, it'll pass us, it'll pass everyone, and everyone is responsible jointly for that outcome.
Thank you, Tom. That really puts it in perspective. Thank you. And Duncan?
Going forward, there's going to be increasing pressure on the amount of water availability from climate change. That's going to both increase the amount of excess water in flood events, but also reduce the amount of sort of general supply and recharge of aquifers through our dry periods. Combine that with population growth, there's going to be this point at which we can't stomach anymore the reducing water availability and the increasing demands. So I think that the do nothing scenario, I don't think is a viable option. But as we creep towards a do nothing, what will it mean is it will mean that water will become more expensive. Thinking into the future, I'd love to see almost like the Martin Lewis of water come in. He's done a great job in giving people the opportunity to take control of their finances, and also then extended that on to lobbying our elected officials to help people with their money pressures. I think as we go forward, I think we all need to work out what we can do. Whilst one intervention at individual scale is not very much, the fact is if we're all doing that, that does provide a significant benefit. But also then to be advocating greater for more national level change, I think will help push some of the things we've been talking about to completion. As Tom said, if we don't advocate, we don't intervene, then slowly we might end up sleepwalking into that do nothing scenario.
Thank you very much. You're all touching on this, but sometimes the individual feels very disenfranchised and a bit, oh, what's the point? So let's zoom in on that individual for a moment and their water usage. Actually, given the subject matter, we shouldn't zoom in on them too much because that could be embarrassing for everybody. But so often with green issues, we hear the same mantra from people. There's no point in doing X, Y, or Z because nobody else is doing it. So people tend to think that their individual actions are quite literally a drop in the ocean, if you'll excuse the pun. Actually, I make no apologies for that pun. So as individuals, what can each of us do? Tom, you talked very absolutely rightly about how we always feel at the start, if we don't instantly see that something's making a difference, we think, oh, what's the point? And if nobody else is doing it, what's the point? But what can we, each of us, be doing?
It's a really good point. I think it's very much a shared responsibility. And I think it's both what you can do as a person, but also your understanding about how these things can change. And I think really good evidence recently of that is the public's dislike of the state of the rivers caused pressure on politicians, which then caused pressure on utilities. And then again, a lot of money became available to make these interventions. A lot of these interventions will cost a lot of resources. So it's important that people understand that. You can, for example, buy showers that will reuse the shower water that you use. So that will save on the energy of heating water. And also it'll be a kind of closed grey water system. We've touched upon what you can do with gardens. Again, it doesn't affect this country, but when you look more widely, if you buy a cotton t-shirt, it takes the same amount of water to make that. So like growing the cotton, refining, all those things, as would support a human for 2.5 years of drinking water. So when you buy a cotton t-shirt, you basically bought almost 3 years worth of drinking water. So it's weird how complex this is, but by the public understanding that having cups of tea is perfectly fine, whereas kind of using vast amounts of water during a drought to water your lawn is probably not the best thing to do. But also putting pressure on your politicians and policymakers is a really positive thing, because unless they know it's important to you, the general population, myself included in that, we won't make the big changes that we need because it goes beyond the kind of budget of any one of us. It has to be shared as a kind of, this is something we want to do as a society. It's important to all of us. And therefore we will redivert some of the nation's funds towards it. But on a personal level, basically don't go for fast fashion, reuse clothes, have some slightly shorter showers, think about your gardening habits because that will probably use a lot more water than you realize.
When it comes to fashion, I think I'm leading the way because I think everything in my wardrobe is probably at least 5 years old. So I'm doing something right there, albeit by accident. Let's go to Louise next. What can the individual do?
Educate yourself, understand how much water you are using and what particular things are using the most water. Talk to your friends about it and educate other people about it. I come from Australia, which I mentioned earlier, and when I was younger, we went through the millennium drought, and actually during school, we got taught how to turn our tap off when we were brushing our teeth. And when I see a tap running, the discomfort in my whole body that I feel when I see that, I just can't stand it. And it stems from that education from a very young age. Talk to your friends, try to reduce your water as much as possible.
Thank you, Louise. In a previous life, I was a primary school teacher, and every now and then you'd hear the hiss of the tap going on. And I'd say, oh, what's going on there? Then a little child would get up, trot over, turn the tap off, and I'd say, congratulations, Billy, you've just helped save the planet. And they all went, oh, so you superheroify children from an early age through their education. And they think, yes, turning a tap on, I'm saving a life, saving the world is a good feeling. Duncan, what can we do to superheroify ourselves, even as grown-ups?
I just want to pick up on this idea that it's just a drop in the ocean. I think we should all embrace the fact that the ocean is just a great collection of drops. Okay, so if we don't all go away and do our little bit of drop, there isn't an ocean. Anything that you can do will help. And although you can't see immediately the reward, apart from the great rain garden example, you may not see how that impacts on the wider environment, but you know that if you are using your water more efficiently, then you are contributing to betterment. That, I think, is important, just to try and dispel that myth about anything I do is a drop in the ocean.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panel. That's Tom McNamara, Louise Clarke, and Duncan Ker-Reid. It's a far more nuanced argument than I initially thought. It's not just about too little or too much water. Water quality is an issue, and there are various options that we could look at. Maybe a 2-tier system would work. That's tier spelled T-I-E-R, not T-E-A-R, although maybe we could make a cup of tea with our own tears one day if we could shed enough. We need to manage water better, both globally and indeed as individuals. Like Louise said, legislation needs to be in place to make people make the right choices. But it also comes down to our shared responsibility too. Doing nothing is not an option. So let's spread the word. Let's keep educating ourselves and each other. And this is just the beginning, so please join us over the coming months. Each episode will, in the words of John Reith, inform, educate and entertain. We have a plethora of exciting guests lined up, from Royal Horticultural Society experts to sci-fi authors. People who can demonstrate how impossible futures might not be so impossible after all. Next month on Sandbox, our episode will be Urban Wonderlands, Grey or Green. No, we're not discussing my frankly bewitching eyes, they're hazel. We are in fact discussing how nature is being brought back into the city landscapes. Join us on another adventure as we explore another topic that touches the lives of all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to the first episode of Sandbox, brought to you by Buro Happold. If you want to add to the conversation, use the hashtag BHSandbox on all your usual social media platforms, including X, known to its friends as Twitter, and LinkedIn. And before our next episode in June, each week there'll be 5-minute podcasts, so look out for Sandbox FOMO 5. They could be outtakes, valuable insights, or thought-provoking elements from an episode that will no doubt enrich your life and knowledge. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to follow the show. You'll find Sandbox in all the usual places, not just behind the sofa, but also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and also on our Buro Happold YouTube channel and on the Buro Happold website.